Let us drift back to the glittering courts of mid-16th century France, a time when nobility wore satin and steel, and diplomacy was just as often conducted with banquet tables as with battlefields. At the center of the French Valois dynasty stood a man whose name would echo not for his diplomacy or his military genius, but for a moment of gloriously avoidable misjudgment. His name was Henry VI, King of France from 1547 until a very, very unlucky summer in 1559. Henry wasn't a fool. In fact, by the standards of kings of the day, he was relatively sharp. He had a flair for politics, a passion for art, a deep love of tournaments, and a deeply competitive spirit. But that competitive streak, dear listener, would become his Achilles' heel, especially when combined with the courtly pastime of jousting, a sport that was as much about status as it was about skill. Jousting, of course, was no child's game. In the 1500s, it wasn't entirely uncommon for nobles to participate in tournaments designed to show off their martial prowess and bravado. By Henry's time, however, jousting had largely become ceremonial. Heavy plate armor was increasingly used to protect vital areas. The lances were crafted to break on impact to reduce fatal injuries, and the tournaments themselves were often more theatrical than combative. But the danger was always lurking beneath the polished surface. The year 1559 was a momentous one for Henry. Peace had just been brokered between France and the Habsburgs, two of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis ended nearly 60 years of intermittent war between the two empires, and the French court rejoiced. To celebrate this hard-won treaty, a grand series of festivals was held in Paris. The streets bustled with pageantry, wine flowed like rivers, and the air was thick with music, perfume, and powdered wigs. The occasion was doubly festive, as the marriage of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, to King Philip II of Spain was also underway. It was an opportunity to demonstrate French glory and royal strength to domestic and foreign audiences alike. Naturally, no royal celebration would be complete without a jousting tournament. Henry, in full regalia and flushed with victory, saw no better way to crown this new peace than by showing off his martial prowess one more time. The fields were prepared, the lists assembled, the courtiers gathered on finely embroidered cushions, and the people swarmed to witness their king in action. Now at 40 years old, Henry was no spring chicken. He had already survived wars, betrayals, and the perils of 16th century dentistry. But despite the warnings from his advisors and even his own astrologer, Nostradamus, yes, that Nostradamus, Henry insisted on mounting a horse, donning full armor, and participating in the tournament himself. It was meant to be symbolic, a king demonstrating strength, vitality, and a dash of good old-fashioned chivalric flair. There were murmurs in court that he should refrain. A monarch jousting was always a calculated risk, but Henry's mind was made up. To him, the sport was an affirmation of royal courage and masculinity, and he would not be seen shirking that duty, not in front of visiting dignitaries, and certainly not in front of his rivals. Enter Gabriel de Montgomery, a Scottish nobleman and captain of the king's personal guard. Gabriel was an experienced jouster, strong, competent, and deeply loyal. He had no intention of harming his monarch, and one can only imagine the sheer horror he felt as he prepared to face his sovereign in mock battle. Still, orders were orders, and the joust commenced. The first two runs went smoothly. Lances shattered. Harmlessly armor clanged, the crowd roared. But Henry, ever the competitor, demanded a third pass. This was where history took its fateful turn. As the two armoured men thundered down the lists, their horses kicking up clouds of dust and adrenaline, Montgomery's lance struck Henry squarely in the face. What should have been a mere splintering blow became a catastrophe. The lance shattered and a long wooden splinter pierced the eye slit in Henry's gilded helmet. It went deep, very deep. The splinter entered just above his right eye and drove into his brain. Henry was thrown from his horse, but he didn't die immediately. That would have been far too merciful. Instead, he lay in agony for over 10 days, as the finest physicians in France did their 16th century best, which mostly involved bloodletting, herbal poultices, prayers, and the occasional application of unhelpful ointments whose ingredients are best left unmentioned. The pain must have been excruciating. Historians describe convulsions, hallucinations, and extended periods of unconsciousness. Physicians attempted to drain fluids from the wound and applied concoctions of vinegar, rosewater, and honey, standard for the time, but tragically ineffective. One doctor suggested drilling into the skull to relieve pressure, but the idea was rejected as too risky. Ironically, it may have been his best shot. Queen Catherine de' Medici, Henry's wife, and a formidable force in her own right, stood vigil by his side. Historians have noted how this event marked a dramatic shift in her demeanour, from queen consort to power broker, from quiet observer to political mastermind. She would go on to play a central role in French politics for the next several decades, largely because of the power vacuum created by Henry's demise. On July 10, 1559, Henry succumbed to his injuries. He died in pain, confusion, and likely some degree of embarrassment. His death not only ended his reign, but also cast a shadow over the celebratory peace treaty that had brought such joy to the court just days earlier. The joust was never meant to be dangerous. It was a ceremonial affair. And yet, in one burst of shattered wood and poor timing, the King of France had been undone, not by war, not by rebellion, but by his own stubborn pride and a piece of splintered pine. In the aftermath, jousting was seen in a very different light. Catherine banned the sport outright at court, declaring it too dangerous, and who could argue with her? When the king dies playing dress-up in steel, it rather spoils the fun. Montgomery, devastated and guilt-ridden, was pardoned by Catherine, though he later fled into exile and became a Protestant rebel, further complicating an already tense political landscape. His life would continue in rebellion, but his name would always be remembered for the splinter that brought down a king. The ramifications of Henry's death echoed far beyond the lists of that fateful tournament. His young sons, too young to rule independently, found themselves pawns in the turbulent religious wars that would soon engulf France. Catherine's iron grip on the monarchy grew, and with it came a period of regency marked by intrigue, bloodshed, and shifting alliances. Henry's death in some ways lit the fuse that would lead to the French wars of religion, decades of civil conflict between Catholics and Huguenots that ravaged the kingdom. What's more, the death of a king in such an undignified and accidental manner sent ripples across European courts. Monarchs elsewhere were forced to re-evaluate their public spectacles, especially those involving potential personal risk. It subtly shifted how kings performed their power, not just in armour on horseback, but in diplomacy, image, and restraint. The spectacle of sovereignty had to evolve, from medieval bravado to Renaissance refinement, from brawls in the list to elegance in the salon. Henry's passing also solidified the role of Catherine de' Medici as one of the most influential women in European politics. The widow of a fallen king, mother to future monarchs and queen, regent in a time of turmoil, her legacy would be one of both controversy and consequence. She was seen by some as a stabilizing force and by others as a manipulative mastermind behind many of the kingdom's darkest events, including the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. But whether heroine or villainess, her role in that wake of Henry's death was undeniably transformative. So what are we left with, dear listener? A cautionary tale, not just of poor decision-making, but of how history sometimes turns on the smallest of things: a sliver of wood, a flash of pride, a king who refused to duck. A moment of grandeur turned to tragedy by a single mistake, a lesson as old as history itself. One that echoes softly beneath the iron masks and silken standards of ages past. And as you sink deeper into sleep, let the lesson linger. When the astrologer warns you not to joust, maybe just listen. And maybe, just maybe, don't. Try to prove yourself in a sport that involves charging at someone with a sharpened tree trunk for fun. History doesn't always favor the bold. Sometimes it simply records their final blunder with ink as sharp as any lance. And if, centuries from now, some sleepy soul listens to this tale and chuckles gently in the twilight between wakefulness and dreams, well, perhaps that too is a kind of immortality. After all, what is a story but a legacy whispered in the dark, passed down from voice to voice, generation to generation, carried softly like a feather on the breeze of time? Because, in the end, even a king brought low by a wooden shard finds a kind of eternity not in marble but in memory. And you, dear listener, now carry that memory. You cradle it gently as you drift further, deeper, more peacefully into rest. Good night, and may your dreams be free of splinters. Because in the end, even a king brought low by a wooden shard finds a kind of eternity not in marble but in memory. And you, dear listener, now carry that memory. You cradle it gently as you drift further, deeper, more peacefully into rest. Good night, and may your dreams be free of splinters. The shell, the sky, and the playwright who should have stayed. Indoors, let us now drift farther back, dear listener, beyond the powdered wigs and Renaissance revelry, to the sun-soaked hills of ancient Sicily. The air is thick with olive trees, the scent of fig and sea salt. It is the 5th century BCE, and the Greek world is alive with philosophy, tragedy, and a man named Aeschylus, a father of drama, a voice of theatre, and the victim of perhaps the strangest death ever scribbled in the margins of history. Aeschylus was no minor figure. His works laid the very foundation of Greek tragedy. He penned nearly 90 plays, and though only a handful survive, titles like Agamemnon and the Persians have echoed through the ages. He fought at Marathon, rubbed shoulders with the divine in myth and metaphor, and brought depth to the stage that would inspire generations. And yet, despite his intellect, his heroism, and his mastery of words, Aeschylus met his end not at the hand of war or rival, but beneath a sky, beneath a bird, beneath a tortoise. Yes, a tortoise. Here's how the story goes. It is said that in his later years, Aeschylus grew increasingly wary of fate. A prophecy reached him, perhaps through the oracle of Delphi or a less reputable source, that he would one day die not by sword or illness, but by something falling upon his head. Aeschylus, being a rational man in irrational times, took the prophecy to heart. He began spending much of his time outdoors, believing that no object could fall upon him under an open sky, no rafters to collapse, no roof tiles to dislodge, no theatrical set piece to betray him. But oh, how fate must have chuckled! For while the sky is vast, it is also home to creatures with wings and claws and curious culinary habits. Somewhere above, soaring on thermals and instinct, an eagle, likely a bearded vulture or lammergeier, clutched its prize, a tortoise. These birds were clever, too clever. They had learned to drop hard-shelled prey from great heights onto rocks to crack them open and reveal the soft meat inside. It was a strategy honed by time and avian genius, but this eagle made a fatal miscalculation. From its bird's-eye view, it spotted what it thought was a flat stone, perfect for its grisly culinary performance. What it had actually seen, glinting under the Mediterranean sun, was the bald head of Aeschylus. The tortoise was released. It fell, fast and true, propelled by gravity and destiny. And in a single, surreal moment, Aeschylus's life ended exactly as foretold, by a falling object. A shell from the sky, a gift from the gods, or perhaps a prank by them. Imagine the scene. Aeschylus, wise and wandering, perhaps reciting lines from a new play or composing in his mind. The rustle of trees, the distant hum of cicadas, and then silence, a thud. The fall of curtain, not on a stage, but on his very life. Now, historians have debated this tale for centuries. Some claim it's apocryphal, a story woven from the fabric of irony too perfect to be real. Others insist it must be true, for who would invent such a death and expect to be believed? But whether fact or fable, the death of Aeschylus has endured as one of antiquity's most bizarre and oddly poetic ends. And if we examine it closely, there's almost a moral to be found. Perhaps it's about the futility of avoiding fate, or the folly of taking prophecies too literally, or perhaps it's simply a lesson in not underestimating birds with a culinary plan. To grasp the full absurdity of this tale, consider how rare such an event would be. The eagle had to be flying at the right height. The tortoise had to be of just the right weight. Aeschylus had to be standing in precisely the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. The odds of it all aligning were astronomical, and yet it happened, or at least the story did. And in some ways, a good story is its own kind of truth. The Greeks were no strangers to irony. Their tragedies often revolved around fate, hubris, and divine mischief. Perhaps that's why the tale of Aeschylus's death resonated so deeply. Here was a man who wrote tragedies being trapped in one of his own. Here was a thinker brought low by a bird. It was, in some twisted way, thematically consistent. His fellow dramatists, some of whom may have viewed him with envy or reverence, could hardly have imagined such an end. Euripides and Sophocles, contemporaries in his wake, must have pondered the sheer absurdity of it, how a man who shaped the soul of Greek drama could find his final act dictated not by gods or kings, but by an eagle with lunch plans. Over the centuries, artists, writers, and thinkers have reinterpreted his death not as mere tragedy, but as divine satire. Scholars have debated whether the gods punished Aeschylus for hubris, or rewarded him with a uniquely theatrical demise. In Plato's Symposium, dramatic irony was dissected like philosophy, but Aeschylus's end, it became a kind of unwritten footnote to every lesson on fate. Beware the sky, and so the tale lived on, through scrolls and whispers, through scholars and jesters. It passed from age to age, gathering texture like an oyster gathers pearl. Every time it was told, it shimmered a little more. A cautionary tale, a cosmic joke, a meditation on mortality and irony wrapped in a reptilian shell. There is a solemnity to it, but also a strange comfort. For if the brilliant Aeschylus could be undone by a bird and a turtle, then truly none of us are safe. And somehow that makes us all a bit more equal. A philosopher and a farmer, a king and a mason, all fall under the same sky. And every one of us might one day be the punchline in fate's favorite joke. So if you, dear listener, ever find yourself trying to outsmart fate, consider Aeschylus, consider the sky, consider the bird, and maybe, just maybe, keep your eyes open. As you breathe deeper now, let your mind wander to ancient stages and olive groves, to playwrights and poets who once believed the heavens held only the stars. Know that even brilliance is no shield from the whims of the world. And in that humble truth, there is something oddly comforting. Close your eyes and let the last image linger. The slow spiral of a tortoise through blue sky, fate dropping softly, absurdly, perfectly into place. But let us not leave Aeschylus behind too quickly, for even after his untimely death, his legacy continued to grow in curious and ironic ways. Statues were raised in his honor, stoic, proud, and unflinchingly upright. Some say deliberately built with wide-brimmed helmets, just in case. His works, though incomplete, became canon in the centuries that followed, studied not only for their tragic depth, but also for the enigmatic life of their creator. In modern times, his story is often shared alongside those of history's most unusual demises. It circulates through classrooms, trivia nights, and midnight documentaries, always greeted with a mix of laughter, disbelief, and awe. One can't help but marvel at the theatrical symmetry of it all. Here was a man who sought meaning in the cosmos, who dared to give voice to the divine, only to be answered in the most farcical fashion. His name appears on monuments and curricula, alongside sober accounts of classical wisdom and ancient conflict. And yet, beneath the citations and accolades, there lingers that odd final chapter, a reminder that the universe sometimes has a sense of humor. Perhaps in this way, Aeschylus became more immortal than he imagined, not merely for his verses, but for the very human irony of how he left the stage. And so his final lesson may not lie within a scroll, but in that one unforgettable scene, a man, a sky, a tortoise, and the silent agreement between absurdity and inevitability. Let this tale linger as you drift off. Let the irony soften the world's sharp edges. Let it remind you that sometimes stories are stranger than sense, and that fate, ever creative, always saves its greatest curtain calls for the ones who think they've read ahead in the script. Rest well, dear listener, the tortoise has landed. Rest well, dear listener, the tortoise has landed. And now, with your mind nestled in the strange serenity of this tale, let us wander a bit further through time and imagination. What if Aeschylus had survived that fateful encounter? Would he have written a play mocking the gods? A satire about divine punishment from the sky? It is tempting to think that a man of his wit would have turned tragedy into comedy, as he did so many times before. In this alternate timeline, we might imagine Aeschylus seated under a fig tree, quill in hand, scribbling down a new kind of tragedy, one where the chorus doesn't lament death by sword, but debates the symbolic meaning of shell versus stone. Aeschylus, ever introspective, might have created an entirely new genre, existential shell comedy, blending fatalism with absurdity in ways that would echo through the centuries. Greek audiences, lovers of spectacle, might have embraced such a play with a roar of laughter mingled with the hum of philosophical thought. They would not merely watch the drama, they would feel themselves inside the cosmic joke, victims and witnesses all at once. Perhaps even Sophocles would have wept from laughter. But of course, this is not what happened. The real tale ended abruptly. A falling tortoise, a sudden thud, a stunned eagle perhaps watching from above, unsure if the delivery had gone too far. And yet, the story remains. Not merely because it is strange, but because it resonates. It forces us to consider the randomness of existence, to marvel at the delicate, ridiculous threads that bind life to death. It is this unpredictability, this cosmic theatre, that makes us human. And in that spirit, as you drift into the gentle tide of dreams, hold tight to the thought that history is not just a record of what happened, but a treasury of wonders, of warnings, and of wildly improbable things that somehow miraculously did. The barrel, the fall, and the teacher who took a plunge for fame. We now drift forward to a world not filled with emperors or eagles, but with spectacle, bravado, and the thundering roar of falling water. Let us glide softly into the early 20th century, October 24th, 1901 to be exact. The place? The border between Canada and the United States. The soundscape. The endless crash of one of nature's greatest wonders, Niagara Falls. Here we meet Annie Edson Taylor, a former school teacher, a widow, and by her own admission, a woman desperate to make a name for herself. At 63 years old, Annie sought not retirement or rest, but immortality. And in her mind, there was only one way to achieve it, by being the first person to survive a plunge over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Yes, a barrel. Annie was not a daredevil by trade. She had led a respectable life in the classrooms of Michigan and New York, teaching etiquette and arithmetic, but tragedy had eroded her security. Her husband had died young, her finances had dwindled. With no pension, no savings, and little hope of support, Annie saw the waterfall not as doom, but as opportunity. If she could survive the fall, the fame would follow. Speaking tours, book deals. Enough, perhaps, to ensure a comfortable end. So, she had a barrel made. It was a custom design, constructed of oak and iron bands padded with a mattress and sealed tightly with a bicycle pump to create internal pressure. Her plan was to go over the edge on her birthday, a rebirth of sorts. The stunt was widely discouraged. Local authorities, journalists, and even her hired manager warned of the risk. But Annie, armed with a fierce mix of courage and desperation, pressed forward. Before she took the plunge, she tested the barrel by sending it down the falls with a cat inside. The cat survived, drenched and confused, but alive. Encouraged by the feline's fortitude, Annie climbed into the barrel herself. With the eyes of the curious and the concerned fixed on the river's edge, her helpers secured the lid. A few deep breaths, a final nod, and then she was launched.
Into the current. The barrel bobbed, turned, and was carried by the churning rapids. It drifted closer and closer to the precipice. Then, with a sudden lurch, it vanished over the edge. Seconds passed, then minutes. Spectators held their breath.
At the bottom of the Horseshoe Falls, mist churned and frothed like boiling soup. Eventually the barrel was spotted, battered and spinning, but miraculously intact. It was pulled from the river by a hook and rowboat. They pried open the hatch. Annie, Edson Taylor, emerged, bruised, battered, alive. The crowd roared. Reporters scribbled madly. Photographs were taken. Annie had done what no one had dared, and she had survived. But what followed was not quite the life of luxury she had envisioned. Her fame was fleeting. Her manager ran off with the barrel. Crowds moved on to new spectacles, and Annie, despite her daring, lived out her days selling souvenir photos, and, speaking of her fall, she spent her final years in poverty, never seeing the riches she believed her stunt would yield. Her tombstone at Oakwood Cemetery in Niagara Falls reads simply, "First to go over the Horseshoe Falls in a barrel and live." And so we are left with a tale of ambition, a woman who sought immortality and found infamy instead. A feat of foolish courage, wrapped in rivets and drenched in symbolism. Perhaps it was not dumbness that led Annie over the falls, but hope. A hope that one act could change a life. That one barrel could carry more than just her body. It could carry her
legacy, as you lie still now.
Hearing only the gentle flow of your breath, think of Annie floating silently in the mist, daring to believe that the fall would bring her flight. The falls, dear listener, are not always fatal, but they always change what enters them, and so too do the decisions we make, even the reckless ones, alter the path beneath our feet. But let us not roll the credits on Annie just yet, for her story, though brief in glory, ripples outward like the waters she dared to tame. It raises timeless questions. What drives a person to seek danger in pursuit of meaning? What makes the quiet soul risk everything for a moment of noise? After her plunge, Annie sought to capitalize on her feat. She gave lectures, sold postcards of herself in front of the falls, and even penned a memoir. But the American appetite for novelty is relentless. New spectacles arose, tightrope walkers across the gorge, men in steel spheres, others who'd attempt the plunge with even less preparation. Annie's singularity was short-lived. She spent money trying to retrieve her stolen barrel, the very vessel of her fame. But it had vanished, perhaps scrapped for parts, perhaps sold to a collector, perhaps simply forgotten in a barn. It was not just a prop. It was the centerpiece of her life's gamble. Without it, her story had no anchor. Desperate, she hired an imitator to play herself at shows while she rested backstage. Audiences were none the wiser, but the impersonator often pocketed more than Annie earned. Such was the harsh irony. The woman who survived Niagara could not survive show business. By 1921, Annie was living in a boarding house near the falls, still offering tales of her great plunge. Her eyesight was fading, her health was poor, but she never stopped telling
her story.
She never stopped believing it mattered. When she passed, local citizens raised funds for her burial. She was laid to rest in a modest plot beside other daredevils who had not been so lucky. Her monument remains a quiet tribute among louder stones. Niagara Falls today is surrounded by railings and warning signs. Tourists snap selfies. Boats venture to the base of the falls wearing plastic ponchos, safe and controlled. Yet behind the polished tours and pristine walkways lies a legacy of risk, ambition, and occasional madness. Annie Edson Taylor was the first, but not the last. Over the years, many followed. Some lived, many did not. But none had the pure blend of naivety, resolve, and daring that Annie possessed. She believed not just in her survival, but in her transformation. She hoped the falls would wash her old life away and reveal something new. In truth, it simply revealed who she already was, a determined woman caught between eras, chasing immortality in a wooden capsule. Her barrel did not just carry her through the torrent. It carried every quiet question we've asked ourselves. Am I enough? Will I be remembered? What happens if I leap? So when your own days feel heavy and forgotten, when your courage seems small and your audience silent, remember.
Annie, she dared.
She fell. She survived. And even if the world didn't pay her what she was owed, history still keeps her name afloat. Not because she was famous, but because she was unforgettable. Let her final act be a lullaby to the restless, a message to the quiet dreamers, and a beacon for those who think their chance at wonder has passed. It never has. And perhaps as you drift into the quiet place where dreams and memory merge, you can imagine what Annie might have said had her story gone differently, if she had gained the wealth she deserved, if the world had remembered her with more than a whisper. Perhaps she'd have been interviewed years later by the roaring falls, surrounded by grandchildren or students, reflecting on a life both ordinary and extraordinary. And she might have said something like, "I did not go over the falls because I was fearless. I went over because I was afraid of being forgotten." It is this kind of paradox, fear driving courage, that lies at the heart of so many strange chapters in history. It is what compels humans to chase volcanoes, to climb mountains, to leap from ledges both literal and figurative. Annie's journey wasn't just a plunge, it was a plea, a hope that the world still had a place for the bold-hearted, even when they came late in life and wrapped in layers of doubt. Let her remind you that audacity doesn't always look like bravado. Sometimes it looks like a retired teacher from Bay City, Michigan, squeezing herself into a barrel lined with pillows, whispering a prayer as the river pulls her forward. So, sleep now, with her name soft on your breath. Annie Edson Taylor, the woman who fell for history and somehow made it catch her. Close your eyes now. The river waits only in your mind. But the spirit of the plunge, that strange blend of fear, hope, and wild resolve, flows on. Good night, and may your dreams be worthy of the leap. So sleep now, with her name soft on your breath. Annie Edson Taylor, the woman who fell for history and somehow made it catch her. And perhaps as you drift into the quiet place where dreams and memory merge, you can imagine what Annie might have said had her story gone differently, if she had gained the wealth she deserved, if the world had remembered her with more than a whisper. Perhaps she'd have been interviewed years later by the roaring falls, surrounded by grandchildren or students, reflecting on a life both ordinary and extraordinary. And she might have said something like, "I did not go over the falls because I was fearless. I went over because I was afraid of being forgotten." It is this kind of paradox, fear driving courage, that lies at the heart of so many strange chapters in history. It is what compels humans to chase volcanoes, to climb mountains, to leap from ledges both literal and figurative. Annie's journey wasn't just a plunge, it was a plea, a hope that the world still had a place for the bold-hearted, even when they came late in life and wrapped in layers of doubt. Let her remind you that audacity doesn't always look like bravado. Sometimes it looks like a retired teacher from Bay City, Michigan, squeezing herself into a barrel lined with pillows, whispering a prayer as the river pulls her forward. Portion 4, The Feast, the Fire and the Viking. Who laughed at death, let us journey now to a land of icy winds and fiery legends, a place where the sea howled like wolves, and warriors carved their names into sagas. Our next tale of misfortune and misjudgment takes us to 11th century Scandinavia, where the Viking chieftain Sigurd the Mighty met his end not by sword, axe, or arrow, but by the very head of a man he had already slain. Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty, was an Earl of Orkney, part of what is now northern Scotland. As a Viking warlord, Sigurd was bold, merciless, and known for expanding Norse control over Pictish territories. His campaigns were brutal and successful, but with victory often comes overconfidence, and for Sigurd that would prove to be his undoing. Sigurd challenged a local Pictish chieftain named Brigte, also known as Brigte the Buck-Toothed, to a duel. This wasn't uncommon in Norse and Celtic culture. Honor was everything, challenges were sacred, but Sigurd, never one to play fair, brought more than just himself. He brought 40 men, violating the terms of the duel and overwhelming his opponent. Bright fought bravely, but was slain in the ambush. As a trophy of his deceitful victory, Sigurd strapped Brighte's severed head to the side of his saddle, perhaps as a warning or a macabre sign of dominance. He rode back triumphantly through the glens and mist, the head bouncing against his leg with each step of his horse. But fate, as we have seen, has a flair for poetic justice. As the story goes, one of Brighte's famously protruding teeth scraped Sigurd's leg as he rode. Just a scratch, nothing more. But that small wound, left untreated, festered, infection spread. And not long after his return from battle, Sigurd the Mighty, conqueror, warlord, earl, died of sepsis caused by the head of the man he had unfairly slain. The irony is almost mythic in its precision. Sigurd, victorious and feared, was undone, not in battle, but by a corpse. Not by strategy, but by a tooth. His tale has endured not just for its absurdity, but for its strange symmetry. The very act of betrayal, violating a duel to ambush a man, brought him poetic vengeance. In a world where honor was blood and reputation was eternal, Sigurd's name became a warning. For centuries, the story was passed down in the Orkneyinga saga, a medieval chronicle that mixes history with myth and legend. And while some details have blurred through the ages, the core remains a masterclass in grim humour and historical irony. But Sigurd's story is more than a tale of poetic punishment. It is a mirror of Viking culture. In a society that glorified conquest, revenge, and divine favour, his death posed questions uncomfortable for Norse pride. Was this divine retribution, the gods restoring balance, or simply a grim accident wrapped in superstition? Some sagas suggest that the gods, especially Odin, took offence at Sigurd's dishonourable actions. While this may be narrative invention, it reflects a deeper truth. The Vikings believed in fate, or weird, as a force that could not be escaped. Sigurd's downfall, by this thinking, was predestined, a tale carved into the runestones of destiny. There is also something deeply human in his story. Who among us hasn't suffered from overconfidence? Who hasn't at some point dismissed a small mistake only to see it grow into something catastrophic? Sigurd's wound was literal, but its symbolic power runs deep. He was a giant brought low not by a rival but by his own arrogance. Historians now use his death as a fascinating entry point into early medieval warfare, Viking customs, and the psychology of power. His life was marked by ambition, his death by irony, and his legacy by a strange sort of immortality, the kind reserved for those whose stories are too strange to forget. Today, in the Orkney Islands, wind still whispers through the ruins of stone longhouses and across moss-covered hills. Locals still speak of Sigurd. Tourists ask about him. His tale, preserved through time, now serves not just as entertainment, but as a lesson in humility. So as you rest tonight, let Sigurd's tale remind you of the balance in all things. That pride often rides just ahead of downfall. That even in victory we are vulnerable. And that sometimes the only difference between a legend and a lesson is a single tooth. Close your eyes. Drift into the chill mists of northern coasts. Hear the clash of steel, the silence of snow, and the laughter of fate whispering through the fjords. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be bold and your saddles clean. And perhaps in some misty dreamscape tonight, you might glimpse a rider on a dark horse, a grinning skull tied to the saddle, and know that stories never die. They simply wait to be retold. But this tale, dear listener, stretches further still. For Sigurd's fate did not just ripple through the icy waves of the Orkneys, it echoed into the laws of legacy, into the bones of every story where hubris meets its match. Some scholars believe Sigurd's death influenced how future leaders thought about power, not just its acquisition, but the superstition that clings to it. In Icelandic lore texts and Norse Eddas, subtle echoes of caution appear, warning not just of dishonour in defeat, but dishonour in gloating. These were people who feared the gods, but feared mockery more. In Viking lore, to become the subject of a laughing tale was to be wounded a second time, and more deeply. Sigurd, in his arrogance, became a figure not of fear, but of farce. A man whose every conquest was overshadowed by his ending. And yet, perhaps that too is a kind of immortality. Archaeologists continue to scour the Northern Isles for remains of his rule. They find blades, buckles, longhouse remnants, traces of a time when men sailed under raven banners and believed death to be a door. None have found his tomb. Perhaps that is for the best. Some stories are meant to remain open-ended, and in classrooms, in bedtime tales, in animated films and modern retellings, Sigurd returns. His saga, now a cautionary fable, still tinged with thunder and mystery, still layered with laughter and loss. We teach him not as a villain, but as a monument to unintended comedy, a parable for pride. And so we stretch this tale a little further, not to rewrite history, but to honor it in full, to see it as the Norse may have seen it, part record, part ritual, and entirely alive. So as the shadows grow long and the fire crackles low, let Sigurd ride once more through your imagination. Let the cold wind wrap around your thoughts. Let the gallop of his horse carry you deeper into the dream. And if your journey tonight finds you in some far, frost-lit hall, with mead in your hand and laughter in the rafters, raise a toast to the tooth, the strange little thing that toppled a mighty man. Sleep soundly, traveller of tales. The sagas are watching, and they are smiling, and still the echoes of Sigurd's end murmur across time, growing with each retelling. One cannot help but imagine how different things might have been if Sigurd had returned from his conquest with modesty rather than pride. What if he had given Maelbrigte a proper burial, or honoured the duel he challenged? Such reflections, though lost to history, linger like fog upon the fjords. Within Viking tradition, skalds, the poets and keepers of memory, were revered. They did more than entertain. They wove morality into melody and satire into saga, and it is from them we owe the preservation of Sigurd's fall, recited with both awe and smirking disbelief. For no warrior, no matter how fearsome, escaped the verse of the skald. To be mocked in poetry was to suffer defeat beyond the grave. Sigurd became a favourite among these storytellers, not for his victories, but because of the bizarre end he met. In their telling, the tale may have grown, as legends often do, but the heart of it remained, that hubris breeds downfall, and even the tooth of an enemy may outlive your legend. Interestingly, the Orkneyinga saga doesn't present Sigurd as a fool. Rather, it respects his stature, his strength, his conquests, but it does not spare him the ignominy of a ridiculous death. This duality, the strength of a warrior undone by the fluke of fate, makes the saga uniquely Norse. There is no moralizing, only observation. And perhaps that is its greatest strength. It allows the audience to laugh and learn in equal measure. Modern historians have studied Sigurd's story not just as entertainment, but as evidence of how oral tradition carried nuanced records. Viking-era storytelling often blurred the line between chronicle and cautionary tale. The use of irony was a deliberate tool, a way to encode lessons in the most unforgettable fashion. Even in the present day, Sigurd's tale resonates. Books, podcasts, and documentaries reference his fall. He's become a character in television dramas, an anecdote in classrooms, a name whispered at reenactments in windswept fields. Children who visit Orkney still hear about the mighty earl who lost to a tooth. This persistence suggests something deeper, that stories like Sigurd's are not just about the man, they're about the mirror they hold to all of us. We all have our victories, we all carry our trophies, but we also bear the risk of forgetting humility. So let this story, nearly swallowed by time, be a spark in your thoughts. Let it remind you that even in the grandest of endeavors, the smallest things can change everything. A loose nail, a careless word, or a tooth. If you find yourself someday on a windswept hill, looking out over grey seas, think of Sigurd. Think of his march through history. Proud, defiant, unforgettable. And then think of that one fateful ride where triumph met tragedy in the form of a simple, stubborn fang. And with that we close the tale, not as a jest, but as a tribute. For in its laughter there is truth, and in its irony there is legacy. Portion 5, the politician, the pancake, and the president who couldn't digest power. Let us now fully settle into this chapter, not just as a quirky presidential anecdote, but as a deeply revealing moment in American history, as peculiar as, it seems, Zachary Taylor's death reflected the fragility of power in a democracy still learning how to balance strength and humanity. Let us sit with this tale not only as an anecdote of historical irony, but as a reflection on the precariousness
of leadership.
Taylor was no polished politician. He was blunt, short-tempered, and utterly lacking in the political finesse common to the capital. And yet it was that raw character that many Americans found trustworthy. His military record, free from scandal, cast him as a figure of honor, however unrefined. He did not campaign for the presidency in the traditional sense. Others spoke for him, plastered his image on banners, and praised his war heroism. He barely made policy promises, and yet the country elected him, a testament to the weight that martial success carried in the American imagination. But this same man, hardened by war, proved ill-prepared for the machinery of Washington. He refused to be molded, and he resisted control. This made him a dangerous force to many in government, unpredictable, principled, and unyielding. Taylor's death handed the reins of government to Fillmore, who, though more pliable and less combative, lacked Taylor's moral line on slavery. In this pivot, the nation shifted course. The balance between North and South, so precariously held, began
to tip.
It is strange to say that a death from indigestion may have tipped the scale toward war, but such is history's strange clockwork. One cog rusts and the whole mechanism moves differently. Biographers still grapple with Taylor's legacy. Some argue that his presidency was simply too brief to judge, while others insist his short time in office revealed a commitment to unity, a sense of duty above politics. He saw America not as a battleground for ideologies, but as a home worth, defending from extremism regardless of party. That he died because of the most ordinary of indulgences, a bowl of fruit and a glass of milk, is not just darkly humorous. It is profoundly symbolic. The strongest institutions, the mightiest leaders, are vulnerable to the smallest lapses. And in that frailty lies the shared humanity that connects presidents to the people they serve. So tonight, remember Zachary Taylor. Not for his battlefield commands or brief presidential signature, but for what he represents, a strange, humbling reminder that even power, when mixed with heat, hunger, and hubris, can curdle unexpectedly. Sleep well, and mind what you eat. Let us now cross the Atlantic and travel to 19th century United States, where history's stage often featured actors as colourful as their policies, and occasionally as bizarre in their exits as they were bold in their entrances. Here we meet President Zachary Taylor, a man whose death was less a tragedy of politics than a cautionary tale of culinary recklessness. Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States, served just 16 months in office before fate, or perhaps his lunch, caught up with him. Born in 1784, Taylor was a war hero, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and steadfast leadership during the Mexican-American War. Old Rough and Ready, as he was known, was more soldier than statesman, and many Americans admired his rustic charm. But Taylor's presidency was cut short in July 1850 under circumstances that, to this day, spark both debate and disbelief. On a sweltering 4th of July in Washington, D.C., Taylor attended the Independence Day celebrations at the Washington Monument. After enduring hours under the sun in a wool suit, the president returned to the White House parched and ravenous. According to historical accounts, he sat down and devoured a meal of raw cherries, iced milk, and copious amounts of cold fruit. Within hours, he began to suffer from severe cramps and gastrointestinal distress. Doctors were summoned. Diagnoses varied: cholera morbus, acute indigestion, or even typhoid. Treatments were primitive: bloodletting, opium, and calomel, a mercury-based laxative. Taylor lingered for 5 days before succumbing to illness on July 9, 1850. What killed him? At the time, physicians blamed the food. Cherries and milk in the heat were believed to disrupt the body's humors. Modern historians speculate it could have been bacterial contamination. Washington, D.C.'s water supply was notoriously filthy. Yet conspiracy theories persist. Some suggest he was poisoned due to his moderate stance on slavery. In 1991, his body was exhumed, and tests showed no lethal levels of arsenic. But the debate lingers like the scent of spoiled fruit on a summer breeze. Regardless of cause, the death of Zachary Taylor remains one of the strangest presidential demises. A national leader brought low not by war or scandal, but by seasonal produce. It was a peculiar end for a man forged in battlefield fire. Taylor had faced down bayonets, survived sieges, and led troops across harsh terrain. But he could not conquer the perils of poor refrigeration, and yet his death changed the course of history. His successor, Millard Fillmore, signed the Compromise of 1850, delaying the Civil War. Had Taylor lived, he might have steered the nation in a radically different direction. While his presidency was short, Taylor's death set into motion debates about presidential succession, health transparency, and even food safety. Historians began re-evaluating how something as mundane as a meal could alter the fate of a country. More importantly, his death triggered new thinking about the personal vulnerability of leaders. The myth of presidential invincibility was pierced, not by an assassin's bullet, but by a summertime lunch. Taylor's behavior in office had signaled a stubborn independence from party lines. He clashed with Whigs who had helped elect him, resisted congressional interference, and viewed compromise on slavery as morally unacceptable. His refusal to support the expansion of slavery into new territories put him at odds with Southern lawmakers, some of whom quietly breathed a sigh of relief at his demise. His funeral, held in sweltering heat, drew crowds from across the capital. The city mourned a war hero, but many also felt the unsettling proximity of death. Political cartoons, ever quick to turn Payne into punchline, soon circulated with cherries and milk perched beside presidential busts. Zachary Taylor's final resting place in Louisville, Kentucky, became a pilgrimage site for curious Americans, especially after the 1991 exhumation. Though no poison was found, interest in his death rekindled conversations about forgotten presidencies and their very real impacts, and while his death may seem trivial now, reduced to jokes and asides, it triggered ripples that ran deep. His passing created room for new voices, reshaped cabinet alliances, and gave way to legislative changes he had resisted. Taylor's hard stance on preserving the Union may have clashed with Fillmore's more conciliatory tone, but both men's actions were written beneath the same shadow, one man's untimely fall. Had Taylor lived, his opposition to the compromise might have sparked earlier confrontations. His rough, uncompromising style could have forced states into extreme positions. In dying, he preserved the slow unraveling of consensus. The great irony was that a man so blunt, so eager to fight, may have prevented civil war through absence alone. And so history turns on curious hinges. Sometimes they are forged of steel and fire. Sometimes they squeak quietly, open on hinges of cherry juice and cream. Today, Zachary Taylor is seldom ranked among the great presidents, but he remains one of the most memorable in his demise. In that alone, he earned immortality, not by victory, but by vulnerability. Not by a grand battle, but by a picnic gone wrong. As you drift into sleep, let that truth comfort you, that even the highest seats of power are not immune to humble endings, that even the strongest bodies falter, and that sometimes the smallest things, a meal, a moment, a mistake, can reshape the course of history. So close your eyes now and listen to the quiet digestion of time itself. And remember Zachary Taylor, not simply as a relic of 19th century politics, but as a bridge between two eras. A man caught between battlefields and ballots, between honor and health, whose greatest historical footnote is also a warning about overconfidence and underestimating the everyday. And while his death may seem trivial now, reduced to jokes and asides, it triggered ripples that ran deep. His passing created room for new voices, reshaped cabinet alliances, and gave way to legislative changes he had resisted. Taylor's hard stance on preserving the Union may have clashed with Fillmore's more conciliatory tone, but both men's actions were written beneath the same shadow, one man's untimely fall. Had Taylor lived, his opposition to the compromise might have sparked earlier confrontations. His rough, uncompromising style could have forced states into extreme positions. In dying, he preserved the slow unraveling of consensus. The great irony was that a man so blunt, so eager to fight, may have prevented civil war through absence, alone. And so history turns on curious hinges. Sometimes they are forged of steel and fire. Sometimes they squeak quietly, open on hinges of cherry juice and cream. Today, Zachary Taylor is seldom ranked among the great presidents, but he remains one of the most memorable in his demise. In that alone, he earned immortality, not by victory, but by vulnerability. Not by a grand battle, but by a picnic gone wrong. As you drift into sleep, let that truth comfort you, that even the highest seats of power are not immune to humble endings, that even the strongest bodies falter.